Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. The official English title, referred to as the Earls of Oxford, often called Oxenford, was given to the de Vere family in 1141 by the Empress Matilda, the daughter to King Henry I of England. The Earls of Oxford primarily lived at Hedingham Castle, which is located in the English county of Essex, and also had the official title as Master Chamberlain of England, a position which they had for 5 centuries and for which still exists in the House of Lords today. Much like the Chamberlain position, after 5.5 centuries of having one of the oldest and grandest titles of English society, the Earls of Oxford simply run out of sons to pass on the title to, and indeed the lands associated. So in 1703, the title went what is known as extinct. No one holds that Earls of Oxford title anymore. But in today's video, I'm going to go through all 20 of those Earls of Oxford in just 20 minutes. 1 minute for every Earl over 5.5 centuries of history. Wish me luck, and here we go. Aubrey de Vere pledged loyalty to the Empress Matilda following the capture of King Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141. By July, he had negotiated for an earldom of his own. After a few choices, he settled on the earldom of Oxford. His father was killed by a London mob in the May of 1141 for this change of allegiance towards Empress Matilda. So the titles that had once been granted by Henry I were now part of the earldom of Oxford. Stephen was released from prison at the end of 1141. Aubrey de Vere repledged his loyalty to the king, and save for a brief moment being arrested in 1143, he remained loyal to the king throughout the anarchy civil war. The second Earl was a military man, having served alongside King Richard I during the Third Crusade, and was returning home in 1194 when he heard of his father's death. And in the 20 years that Aubrey de Vere served as Earl of Oxford, he campaigned periodically across the Angevin Empire, the lands owned by the then kings of England. But during the reign of King John from 1199, the Earl was considered to be one of the king's evil counsellors of state. The third Earl was actually brother to the second, as the only son that the second Earl had was illegitimate and who died during the Fifth Crusade in 1221. But the third Earl was not one of the evil counsellors. In fact, he was one of the 25 barons, guarantors, that oversaw the signing of the Magna Carta by King John in 1215. The next 3 years of the Earl's life were probably the most perilous that he would experience, because he was excommunicated by the Pope, he had his castle besieged twice, he proclaimed 2 new kings, one of which was a sort of a pretender from France, and in all that time had his lands and titles stripped away from him until the February of 1218. Hugh de Vere was born in about 1207 and was the sole heir to the third Earl of Oxford, meaning that when the third Earl died in 1221, Hugh de Vere was too young to claim on the titles, the lands, and indeed the running of the estate associated with the Earldom of Oxford. Isabel of Bolbec, Hugh de Vere's mother, paid 6,000 marks to King Henry III of England to act as the young boy's ward until such a time as he came to his majority. The rest of Hugh de Vere's life as 4th Earl of Oxford was as a governmental reformist, often opposing Henry III and his royal government. And he too, when he died in 1263, only had one son to claim on the estates. But thankfully, this son was old enough. The 5th Earl followed very much in his father's and his grandfather's footsteps, criticising the running of royal government and then actual rebelling against King Henry III during the Barons' War of 1264 to 1267, led by Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester. De Montfort successfully removed Henry III from the English throne following the Battle of Lewes in 1264. He set up the Protectorate, a council of barons that was to run England. But he and his eldest son Hugh were killed at the Battle of Evesham fighting the royal forces of Prince Edward in 1265. The 5th Earl accompanied Simon the Younger with forces from London to assist with de Montfort's campaign in Evesham, but they arrived too late. And as a result, the rebellion was quashed and the Earl of Oxford had his lands and titles stripped away. That was until early 1267, when the dictum of Kenilworth restored King Henry III to the English throne, re-energised the signing of the Magna Carta, and of course restoring the Earl back to his lands and titles. The 6th Earl's life follows very much a military lifestyle. He fought alongside King Edward I and Edward II in campaigns against the kings of Wales and conquering the nation, as well as invasions into Scotland, combating against Robert the Bruce and William Wallace. The 6th Earl only had one son, who unfortunately died in 1329, 2 years before the Earl himself. And so the Earldom of Oxford and the many titles and estates associated was passed down to his nephew, the son of his brother Alfonso. For the majority of his tenureship as the 7th Earl of Oxford, John de Vere was on campaign during the 100 Years' War, fighting alongside King Edward III and the Black Prince. The 7th Earl was at the very famous Battle of Crecy in 1346, where he was one of the captains to the Black Prince. It is said in one of the chronicles that the Earl requested some reinforcements from King Edward III nearby, but the king rebuffed this request, saying that the boy needed to earn his spurs. Thankfully, this faith in the Black Prince was rewarded as the English won the battle decisively. The Earl of Oxford, alongside the rest of the English forces, went to successfully siege the city of Calais, which fell in the September of 1347. But by early 1348, the Earl of Oxford fell ill. He was returned to England and was there for the next 7 years whilst he recovered. Immediately after his recovery, the Earl of Oxford was at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where he probably, no doubt, saw firsthand the capture of the French king. But unfortunately, during the Reims campaign of 1359-60, the 7th Earl died whilst raiding the Burgundian region. The 8th Earl also campaigned during the 100 Years' War, but he died in 1371, just 11 years after his own father had passed away. He left his lands and titles to his 9-year-old son, so therefore couldn't inherit until he came to his majority. The 9th Earl had a very close relationship with that of Richard II, so much so that in 1385 and 86, Robert de Vere was granted the title Marquis of Dublin and the Duke of Ireland. This made de Vere incredibly unpopular with the other nobles and royal members, so much so that rebels under Henry Bolingbroke defeated de Vere at the Battle of Radcot Bridge on the 19th of December 1387. De Vere fled the country and went to Louvain in France. And it's a good thing too, because in 1388, something known as the Merciless Parliament sentenced to death all of those in de Vere's Irish administration, and stripped away all of the titles and lands to all of the favourites under King Richard II. Now the 10th Earl was actually the third son to that of the 7th. he was able to reclaim on his Oxford titles in 1393, having little to no association with his predecessor and nephew, the 9th Earl. And in 1395, the 10th Earl repatriated his predecessor's body to be reburied in England. And it is said that Richard II kissed the forehead of his former friend and potential lover. Yet another underage child became the 11th Earl of Oxford in 1400. So he was under the wardship of the king's own mother-in-law, Joan de Bohun, until December 1406, when Richard de Vere was able to claim on his majority. Despite being one of the most senior, the 11th Earl was actually considered the poorest of all of the nobility. In 1415, the 11th Earl presided over the trial of the Southampton Plot conspirators, who had aimed to remove King Henry V from the English throne. Soon thereafter, the 11th Earl was part of the Agincourt campaign as one of the commanders at that famous battle. The 12th Earl was just 9 years old when his father died in 1417, after many years of campaigning in France. So he was under the wardship of the Duke of Exeter and then the Duke of Bedford until 1429, when he came to his majority. The 12th Earl would become one of the most trusted members of the royal court, becoming a Privy Councillor in 1431, partaking in the Siege of Calais in 1436, and a protector of the peace in France by 1441. He would quash the Kentish rebels of Jack Cade in 1450, and would go on to be a protector of England whilst King Henry VI was going through one of his many bouts of madness. But this loyalty to Henry VI was to be the Earl's downfall. In 1462, the Earl and his eldest son, Aubrey de Vere, were arrested by Edward IV, the king who had deposed Henry the year before. The Earl and his eldest son were tried and they were executed on the 26th of February 1462 for acts of high treason. Thus, the titles and estates associated with the 12th Earl of Oxford were passed down to his second son, John de Vere, but only after 1464. The 13th Earl was seen at some of the most famous battles of the Wars of the Roses, and remained loyal to the Lancastrian king and queen, Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, and as a result he was committed to the Tower for a short time in 1468, and had his lands and titles stripped away from him between 1475 and 1485. But this loyalty to king, country and cause meant that by the time of his death in 1513, the 13th Earl had no children in which to pass on his titles and estates. Now the 14th Earl was the 14-year-old nephew to his predecessor, the 13th Earl. So he was unable to claim on his majority until August of 1520. In June of 1520, the 14th Earl was able to attend the very lavish Field of the Cloth of Gold event, a 2-week period between Kings Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France, a diplomatic mission of sorts. For the remaining years of his life in majority, which granted was only about 6, the 14th Earl lived to excess, so much so that he was completely untrustworthy. He was forbidden from taking public office. He was told in 1523 to reduce the number within his household. And he was also asked to go and live with his father-in-law, the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard. When the 14th Earl died in 1526, aged just 27, he had no sons, no brothers, and not even any uncles to pass on his titles and lands to. Thus, a second cousin was granted the opportunity to become the 15th Earl of Oxford. The 15th Earl was a mainstay of Tudor politics. He presided over the trial of Cardinal Wolsey in 1529. He became a Privy Councillor in 1531 and oversaw the coronation of Anne Boleyn in 1533, as well as her trial just 4 years later. He was at the christening, for the boy King Edward VI, and at the funeral to his mother Jane Seymour. And he also had an opportunity before he died to meet Anne of Cleves. He also became the first Protestant Earl of Oxford at a time of the English Reformation, when the religious landscape changed from the Catholic Pope to the Church of England under Henry VIII. But his son and successor, the 16th Earl, was not quite so forthcoming in this new religious order of Church of England. For he was an ardent supporter of Mary I when she came to the throne in 1553, following the death of Henry VIII and the very short kingship of the boy King Edward VI. In this time he became a magistrate in Essex and presided over a number of so-called anti-Catholic heresy trials, which included one of his own former servants, Thomas Hawkes. The 16th Earl doesn't sound particularly pleasant towards his family either. He was married to Dorothy Neville for a 10-year period, and she actually fled the marriage because she said she had had unkind dealings with the Earl. Now this is probably just the tip of the iceberg and a polite way of saying that the Earl was probably a truly awful human being to be around. When the 16th Earl died in 1562, he left just one son by his second marriage to Marjorie Golding. Unfortunately, his successor was only 12 years old, so he had to wait until 1571 to claim on his majority. As a boy, the 17th Earl of Oxford went to live with William Cecil, and actually went on to marry his daughter Anne. But as an adult, he spent a lot of his time travelling through France and Italy. He pursued the literary arts, writing numerous plays and poems for the English court, and is suggested to be an alternative author to that of William Shakespeare, though take that what you will. But he also had a bit of a financial problem. By the 1580s, he was so bankrupt that the Queen Elizabeth I had to give the Earl £1,000 every year for the rest of his life, just to sustain his lifestyle. Yet another underage child was to become the 18th Earl of Oxford in 1604. The 11-year-old boy went to live with his mother, Elizabeth Trentham. When she died in 1613, she gave him a vast fortune, which he would then use to go on a grand tour of Europe until about 1618. When he returned to England, he was granted the Lord Great Chamberlain position, which had been passed down through generations and generations over 500 years of English history, and for which the 18th Earl would be the last of his family to receive. The 18th Earl wouldn't spend much time back in England, for he pursued the rest of his life on military campaign in Northern Europe, where, following the siege of Terheyden in June 1625, he caught an illness and a fever, which ultimately led to his premature death. Despite the 18th Earl marrying Diana Cecil on New Year's Day 1624, he had no children to pass on his titles and estates. So his successor was his second cousin. Robert de Vere was questioned as to his eligibility. Were his estates adequate enough to inherit the earldom of Oxford? Well, come April 1626, the answer was yes, but only just, because many generations previously had kiboshed a lot of the earldom fortunes. But the 19th Earl had made a life for himself and a home in the Low Countries. He was a soldier within the Dutch army, and he'd married a Dutch lady, Beatrice van Hemond, whom he had one son with in 1627. At the age of 62 years old, and under the command of the Prince of Orange, the 19th Earl partook in the Siege of Maastricht in 1632. Unfortunately, he would be killed during the events of this major battle, leaving his 5-year-old son to become the 20th and last Earl of Oxford. The final Earl of Oxford spent his years living in the Netherlands until he came to his majority in 1651. He was unable to fight during the Civil War, but but he was determined to fight back against Cromwell's protectorate. Unfortunately, he ended up in the Tower of London. But by 1660, he had been released and was petitioning the Hague for the return of King Charles II of England, and so found favour with this new king. He was unable to receive his title as Lord Great Chamberlain, but he was made a colonel of the Royal Horse Guards, where he created a number of regiments filled with soldiers of all walks of life: Puritans, Quakers, Calvinists, Anglicanists, but not Catholics, which during the time of King James II in the 1680s saw the king give a disapproving eye to that of the final Earl of Oxford. The Earl was rather flamboyant in his character and his attire, often wearing his garter robes out in public to much disapproval. He had a relationship with Hester Davenport, a very famous actress of the London plays. He had one son with Davenport called Aubrey de Vere, who was due to claim as the 21st Earl of Oxford. But in a rather strange turn of events, by 1686, the 20th Earl of Oxford decided that his only son was illegitimate and unable to claim on one of the oldest titles of English aristocracy. So when the 20th Earl died in 1703, aged 76, there was no one to claim on this title. No sons, no brothers, no uncles, not even a second cousin. Therefore, the Earldom of Oxford became extinct. And that concludes my 20 minutes on the 20 Earls of Oxford. I hope you've enjoyed this little video of mine, this slightly shorter form of content that I'm creating, and it gives you a snapshot not only to English history, but also into the lives of the de Vere family themselves. I might do another one of these sorts of videos again in the future, obviously with a different title or a different Earl or Duke or whatever. So stay tuned for another video. Thank you for watching again, and I'll see you all later.